Good morning. Welcome to our member webinar that is focused on emerging risks. I'm Samara Sadeghi, Director of Trust Governance here at CST. In case you don't know me, I'm joined today by Matt Humphrey, who is a partner at RSM, and he is the expert on risk. But more specifically, he produces twice a year something called the Emerging Risk Radar. And it's a fantastically useful document. We use it here at CST. And we think all trusts should be using it as well, because as we know, risks are emerging constantly and they're impacting us more quickly. So we do need to evolve how we manage risk and become more agile and more sort of horizon scanning. But actually, that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Matt to tell you about the emerging risk radar. Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Sammy. Good morning, everybody. I think we've got quite a few folk on the call, and we're going to be talking this morning to you for about 35 minutes, then allowing some time for sort of questions and your own observations, of course. And as Sammy said, I think emerging risk is one of the most important aspects of risk management that a board and leadership can engage with at this point in time, given the very fact that we are facing so many challenges globally, nationally, and probably in our own local circumstances. And we need to have a better grip on those in order that we can remain strong providers of education and resilient organisations. And that was probably the basis on which the emerging risk radar that RSM produced, and this is our seventh one, of the reasons why we've gone about this. To give boards, not just in the trust sector, but more wider, some intelligence to work off to help their horizon scanning and their strategy setting and planning. So I'm going to be sharing with you a slide deck. There's not that many slides, you'll be pleased to know, because we'd like to have a bit of a discussion at the end. For those of you who are really fascinated in this subject, and I'm sure you all are, that's the reason why you joined, is RSM will also produce running a workshop at the CST conference in October, where we'll be exploring this subject further. But workshops are going to be great because we can have some good conversations there, and we're bringing along a couple of organisations from the trust world to talk about their experiences of strategic risk, the way they use it, and the way in which they engage with emerging risks. So hopefully you'll find that valuable and useful. As well as obviously the RSM involvement there as well. And for those of you that really love risk management, like myself, then there is also the masterclasses. So I feel like I'm doing some kind of like CST sales pitch here for you. But hey, if you've not been
It's
involved in
brilliant,
this,
Matt. Thank you very
I'll
much.
keep going then in that case. If you've not been involved in the CST or not attended the CST risk management masterclasses, then I suggest you should. It covers three aspects of risk. It goes through the fundamentals, it considers strategic risk, and then it looks at assurance and scrutiny. So something I think which is important to us all. So there we go. When I share the slides, I'll give you a few seconds at the beginning, maybe 5 or 10 seconds, just to consume what's on the slide, because otherwise you'll just get me continually talking, and I'm quite good at that. So today's session, what are we going to do? So I'm going to talk about why emerging risk is important and what that really means to a trust. We're going to have a look at the emerging risk radar very quickly that RSM produced, because I don't think we're going to have enough time to look at every aspect, but you will, if you've not got a copy already, be provided with a copy. I think it's downloadable, if that's such a word, from the CST member portal. And then I'm also going to leave you the few things to take away back to your trust and consider and think about. Okay. And because the way things are, I won't be looking at the chat. So, and if you put any questions in there, I would leave them to the end. So there we go. Okay, well, I'm going to get on with doing a bit of screen sharing. This is providing I can overcome my technical ineptitude when it comes to this sort of thing. You'd really think after 5 years, 6 years of doing this since the pandemic, I'll be all over this, but I still get it wrong. So bear with. And even worse, it's going to be recorded so that actually people can look back and understand how bad I am at doing this. So let's go. Let's see if we can find the right slides. That would be a good start. And oh, it looks like they might have turned up, so that's even better. Okay, fabulous. So I don't need to really talk any further because I think I've given the introduction. There is a link on that slide when you get it, which takes you straight through to the emerging risk radar. I'm going to carry on in that case. So I'm assuming everybody can see the slides. Someone give me a thumbs up. Yeah, Sammy, fabulous, fantastic. Okay. Okay. Right. Thought I'd warm us up a little bit with this slide, which is a particularly important and a slide for us to consider. Now, in a workshop environment, I'll be asking lots of questions around this, but we're not going to have that opportunity. So I'm just going to talk about what you're looking at on the screen. On the right, you can see, obviously, Donald Rumsfeld. For those of you who know who he was Secretary of State for Defense for the US twice, under President Ford, I believe, and then President Bush. Now, he talked about four dimensions of risk management. Everyone at the time thought he'd gone mad, but actually, what he talked about was some really important stuff, and actually, he talked about the way in which then you should consider these risks and the way in which means by which businesses, trusts should engage with those risks. So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you through them if you don't understand them necessarily, and I'm going to give you some examples if I can. I'm also going to talk to you about how you can engage with these types of risk. You've got the four dimensions there. Typically, you know, known, known, unknown, 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 and unknown, known. The last one, you know, known, is the really controversial one, and I'm going to come to that at the end. But one of those things that's really important for trust to understand and get on top of, because it's called a trust killer in my mind when it comes to risks. So, okay. So thinking about the four dimensions of risk here, right? The known known. What do we mean by known known? So largely, we know what the risk is and we know what we're going to do about it. It's that simple. These are typically the risks that you largely have on probably your main core trust risk register, strategic risk register. They're the sort of stuff that you should be on top of and you should be managing. Typical risks that are strategic, let's face it, and important to trusts, safeguarding being one of them. You largely know you carry a safeguarding risk of some kind, and it largely relates to the fact that your arrangements that you might have in place fail to protect or deal with what it should be dealing with. And in those instances, you've got mitigations and plans in place to deal with that. So you know about it and you know what you're doing about it. It's that sort of stuff. Core principal risks that most organisations potentially probably fill their risk register with in most circumstances, not just in trust land, more widely. So just that's the most easy one to deal with. Then we move on to the sort of known unknown, and this is typically emerging risk territory. It's the sort of stuff that's out there and it's floating about in the trust landscape and more broadly, and we recognise it and understand it's there, but we might not be clear about what we're going to do about it. It might not even be a risk to us, but we know it's there and we need to keep our eye on it in some way or form. And I think that's really important to do so because these things then start to accelerate and, as Sammy said, move towards the trust and move towards the trust environment and impact on us. And we need to be ready and prepared for that sort of thing. So these are your known unknowns. They're morphing, they're changing. And my way in which I think we should, and I haven't talked about cars, sorry, I'll come back to that, but known unknowns, my acronym that I have for dealing with these types of risk is WHAM, okay? So that's watch, assess, and monitor. And that's what I'd encourage all organisations to do. They're out there, we watch them, we continually assess them, and then we monitor them with regards to how they might play through into our trust or organisation. Going back to the known known, Sammy didn't nudge me. I'll blame Sammy in this
Sorry.
case. Yeah, you should have said, Matt, what's your car at?
What about car?
What about car? Exactly. So car, because these are the risks that you largely know about, know what you're doing about. This is car. So you're interested in controls. You're interested in ensuring that those controls are effective. So you seek assurance. So you're interested in assurance. And when you don't get the assurance you want, you go into rectification. So controls, assurance, and rectification. That's predominantly where a lot of risk management sits. Okay. And then we've got WAM, not Club Tropicana WAM. I'll mention that. I always do. Okay, then we're moving up to the upper sector of my grid there. And I think once you get above that middle line, you're into some difficult territories there. And let's talk about unknown unknown. Unknown unknown is literally something we have no knowledge about and we don't even know what we're necessarily going to do about it when it turns up. I have a colleague of mine who you might have met on the risk management masterclasses, Rich Mackey. Me and him absolutely argue all day over this. He doesn't believe there's any such thing as an unknown unknown, whereas I believe there actually is because things happen and not in all instances are you necessarily always prepared for them. Our arguing point is always the pandemic, of course. He will argue that in the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, pandemic was clearly sat there as something that potentially we need to have our eye on. That's a really good document to have a look at if you're really interested in this sort of stuff. However, let's face it, most organisations, the pandemic as it was and the type it was something that was very new to us. So it was an unknown unknown. We didn't really expect it, and we weren't really we didn't necessarily have plans to deal with it. What I think is interesting about unknown unknowns is that these drive a lot of innovation within the economy. I was talking to a director of finance at the time during the pandemic, and he said to me that technology in the health service progressed 20 years in that one period, those few months, because the investment went in, the need to think about how we're going to respond to this type of risk and continue business as usual. And I think what it did afterwards was actually accelerate. So if you think about what's happened in the pandemic, and education was no different, we responded really well. So what do we do? RAL is my acronym of how we deal with an unknown unknown. We react. Of course, we react. We adapt. Naturally, we did, and we learned from it. So if we have a pandemic again, we know what we're largely going to do. We've had learnings. Those learnings become part of our control environment. So react, adapt, and learn. So we've been through three dimensions. We've got one dimension left, okay? And this is the one that I said was the trust killer. And I call it a trust killer, could be an organization killer. And it's an unknown known, quite difficult to get your head around. And it's quite controversial in some instances. But an unknown known is something that largely we do know about, but we fail to do anything about it,
Mm.
okay? Now, I've got some really controversial ones, okay, that I could talk about. And I'm just going to mention some. And depends how you feel about this. You might not think they're necessarily an unknown known, but I think based on what we understand now, potentially these were typical unknown knowns. My example, first one, is the Horizon accounting system with the post office scandal that then ensued. Why do I think that's an unknown known? Well, if we understand what went on based on what we believe in the public domain, there were instances where people were reporting there were problems, but I think it served maybe certain individuals and organizations to maybe just gloss over that and go with the flow because it was probably easier to do so. I don't necessarily know, but looks like an unknown known to me. Another one, this is a controversial one for you all, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody whatsoever, but Lucy Letby at the trust where she was a nurse and she killed a number of young infants. Again, looking at the inquiry notes that have come out, there were indications that people were suspicious. But how was this being reported? How was this being dealt with? I'm just saying. So it's worth thinking about. Now I'm going to go to another one which I like personally, and that's Barings Bank. For those of you that can remember that, I probably shows my age there. 1995 Barings Bank failure. Um, I think this is particularly interesting. Why is it interesting? Not because of all what went on, but we do know in the Barings Bank failure that internal audit reported there was a problem in the fact that Leeson was able to basically write up the books and undertake checks and balances. There was no supervisory control. This led to a number of fraudulent transactions being covered up by him. Okay, on paper, the bank were making significant amounts of profit. In reality, the cash was all going over to Cymex because there's a drawdown arrangement. So indication was making profit on paper, no cash. So, maybe too good to be true. The bank really didn't know what they were doing. It was a complex financial instrument that Barings were involved in Asia. They'd never done it before, but it looked good and they didn't question it. Maybe that was an unknown known. And interestingly, because I follow these sort of things, I was just looking at something from 1989, and it was the Marchioness disaster. For those of you who remember that, there was a massive inquiry, and there was a huge report that came out with a number of recommendations. Okay, one of those recommendations about watertight compartments on older vessels operating on the Thames has never been addressed and still being argued over. Maybe that is an unknown known when we have one of those vessels sink again with a number of loss of lives. You can see where I'm coming from. It's stuff we know about, but we fail to deal with it. It might also be down to individuals within the organisation. Maybe we don't want to tackle them. Maybe they're just too important. Maybe it's sacred cows. But I think we need to think about this sort of stuff. Anyway, my acronym for dealing with this type of risk is ACT. And ACT is acknowledge, understand you've got a problem, communicate that with individuals within the trust, and tackle it. Now, the tackling it may lead to nothing, or it might prove there is an issue that you need to address. So there you go. So I think, right, in all my times of working with risk, and I heard Rumsfeld when he talked about this originally, and I thought, what's going on? I think it's really interesting to compartmentalize risk in this way and think about this. The unknown known is the trust killer. Your known known is your typical strategic risks, 80% your risks. Your known unknown is your typical emerging risks that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to be talking about emerging risk a little bit further, but I thought I'd give that as a little bit of a warm up in order that we could get our juices flowing. So just moving on. So I'll let you read that first of all. Okay, well, I've read it very quickly. I wrote the slide so I know what's on it. A couple of things there. Okay. Um, So in 2024, the UK Code of Corporate Governance, that's mainly deals with listed companies, and I think it's trying to expand into what could be public interest entities. You might determine that a trust is a public interest entity in the form that you've got various public stakeholders. But either way, the UK Code of Corporate Governance to me is a really good code to look at. But what it did introduce in 2024, very specifically, it started to reference the board's responsibility for understanding emerging risk. If the UK Code of Corporate Governance is doing that, and bringing that change in, it obviously feels this is an area that boards were not necessarily spending enough time on, and as a result, organisation failure was occurring. So it brought in reference to emerging risk as well as principal risks. So principal risks are those core strategic risks that you are particularly managing that will be fundamental in the achievement of objectives or impact on your objectives, should I say. What's really interesting as well, conversations I have with Leora, and Sammy's referenced this already, but Leora uses it, the emerging risk radar, with her board. She uses it to create a dialogue and a conversation piece to understand largely what this means to CST. You know, how could these play through into the organisation itself, and also CST members. And that's what drives a lot then of the conversations that then happen with regards to risk. And in fact, if for some of you that joined a session a while back where Leora, at short notice asked me to join, but she was talking about organisational resilience. And I think actually, understanding and having a longer term view and a wider view on this type of risk is really important as part of that ability to be prepared for what might be out there and what might play through into our environment and how we might manage it. And what's really interesting, I find, about emerging risk is because it's changing as it goes. And because it's not necessarily something that we already know about and we know how we're going to deal with it, it drives very innovative solutions to think about the way in which a trust might mitigate that risk. Quite strategic solutions, I found as well. Sometimes often difficult solutions because it might mean merger and stuff like that. But all the same, what it does mean is long-term sustainability of the sector, which we're all interested in. Okay, so just sort of position that. Why is it important and what an emerging risk is using our definition that we use at RSM and why it's important to keep an eye on those. Okay, now this slide, give you a few seconds to consume this one as well because there's a few components on here. Right, okay. So I talk about strategic risk a lot. And to me, a strategic risk is largely an uncertainty that is associated with the achievement of your core strategic objectives as a trust. And I think those uncertainties are going to have a material impact in the form of loss or lost opportunity for the trust. So we're talking about big ticket items. We're not necessarily talking about failures at operational level that cause problems and ripples, but you get over. We're talking about stuff that are going to be problematic if you do not get them right. I made reference to safeguarding right at the beginning. All trusts as a known would really want to be reporting on their safeguarding arrangements and be on top of those because we know what the implications could be, for individuals within the trust, that's staff and also students and pupils. Not only that, also how the regulator sees it as well. So that's quite an important aspect and a good example. But however, I think strategic risk is made up of a number of component parts. Okay. Emerging risk, which we're talking about at the moment, principal risks, opportunities, and fundamentals. I'm going to come back to those. And I think we need to have an eye on all of these and I'm going to explain why they're important to a trust. But at the top left-hand corner of the screen, you can see a box that says intelligence. Sammy's referenced horizon scanning. This is absolutely the area where the trust board needs to be. Okay. The trust board needs to be sitting, looking ahead, providing direction, setting strategy, putting in place mechanisms and controls to ensure we achieve that strategy. But this is where I think boards play an important part and don't always do it. I think boards get sucked into weeds and details, and sometimes that's convenient for trusts to do that because they feel comfortable. But I'm suggesting that boards need to be very strategically focused nowadays, given all what's going on in the sector and beyond. Okay, so drawing on that intelligence, the intelligence your board members have. Why do you have a board? You draw on their knowledge and experiences to create a collaborative group who can provide guidance to the trust and assist in the leadership. That's what the board's there to do. If you're not getting that from your board, then I need you to think about what membership you've got. But that's what a board is there for, to help guide and set strategy. And I think using all of their knowledge and experience on a regular basis, and I would suggest that actually having sort of like 6 monthly type away days to think about this sort of stuff, to reinvigorate and reset strategy is really important. Strategy is becoming more agile. It has to be because of what's happening in the environment. You cannot set a strategy and then think this will last the next 3, 5 years. I think it's impossible. I think it's impossible nowadays. I think strategy needs to be reflected on and changed. And therefore, I think your strategic objectives might need to change. And hence, you can see the link with intelligence feeding into strategic objectives, intelligence feeding into your risk profile. When I used to talk about risk management, I used to say, set your strategy and then determine the risks that might impact on your strategy. Yeah, I agree with that. But nowadays, they're so intertwined that the risk actually could drive the strategy. Why would you set a strategy that you know is so risky it will never be achieved? There we go. So anyway, let's think about what strategic risk is made up of. Emerging risk, we're talking about principal risk I've made reference to, the core risks that you're familiar with. I want us to also think about opportunity. I do lots of sessions around opportunity risk and what that means. And I'm also encouraging organisations to separate identify what they might be so they are pursued. Because one of the things I've found in all my time with risk management is that boards do not do that. They tend to see risk as being quite a negative, but risk also provides a massive opportunity for the board to look at the way in which it provides services and the way in which it might mitigate risk in some way or form. As I said, that can lead to some difficult decisions and challenges that you might have to face. But exploring opportunity, I think, is really important. What I find with organisations who do not manage opportunity risk well enough is that they have a sort of suboptimal outcome in the midterm. They achieve their objectives, but maybe not as well or as best as they could. Then fundamentals. Fundamentals are things like compliance, regulation, your trust values, the behaviors, the ethics. I think often they get missed, but I think from a strategic risk perspective, all of these four components are things that you need to be thinking about as a board and seeking assurance over. And as you can see, understanding all of those actually influences one, your strategic objectives, naturally, having that knowledge. There's interplay between the two, but also by understanding all of that, you can make better decisions. I think it's really important to explicitly reference your strategic risks when you're making decisions and what they might mean. You can establish monitoring mechanisms to make sure that you stay on top of each of these component parts and ensure they are progressed sufficiently well. You can create a board assurance framework around these to make sure that actually these are effective as you want them to be, and that you are have the confidence that you need that the mechanisms and arrangements in place are working as you should. And of course, your risk appetite as a trust is influenced massively by all of these. Risk appetite does not set, it's not set, it doesn't fix at one point. It changes and shifts. It's like a barometer informed by all of these aspects. So by getting this in place, I'm not saying getting it right, but by having it in place and ways and means by which you can update this starts to inform the way in which you engage and think about risk so significantly differently to the betterment of your trust. So I just want to position that to see this is how it all starts to fit together and why it's important and why it keeps your board focused. So here's the 5 questions that you might want to ask or ask yourself as a board. This is what I encourage all boards to consider. Um, I don't need to read them. I think you can read them yourself. And hence the reason why we produce the emerging risk radar to aid that process. Okay, stage 5 questions. Take those away, ask your board those questions. I think it's worthwhile doing. You'll get a lot from your board, most definitely. That's getting value from the board, and that's where they need to be. Okay, we're going to move into the emerging risk radar now. So just to explain the emerging risk radar, for those of you who have not looked at the version that's downloadable or that I think Sammy has shared in the chat. So we produce this every 6 months, spring, autumn, and we largely update it based on conversations that we have with boards in all sectors. So it's not necessarily RSM sat in a dark room thinking up stuff. This is actually us engaging with boards, understanding how they're perceiving things, seeing things from an emerging risk perspective. Um, these are the top three. okay, that currently exist in the seventh publication of the RSM Emerging Risk Radar. I don't think you'd necessarily be surprised to see those, although, of course, how things are, one of those items potentially may have changed, but you'll see that when we come on to the Emerging Risk Radar, and I'm sure Sammy will expand a little bit more on that as well. Um, but typically, all of these, if you think about it, actually play through into your trust. Most definitely, if I went back 10 years and I used to talk about risks of this nature, largely people would go, yeah, but they're sort of quite a long way away. How does that play through into us? Well, they do nowadays, and you feel it. Every one of those, geopolitical instability. I don't need to expand on that, but we can see the ramifications of that in various ways, and they are impacting most obviously in costs on trusts, but also impacting in various other ways, even down to sort of mental health and well-being. People get nervous about this sort of stuff. Let's not avoid it. Kids worry about it. You've got a lot of children within schools and pupils who probably want to talk about this sort of stuff. Cyber attacks, don't need to talk about that really. We've seen what's happened. Some people might say, how's that an emerging risk? It's always an emerging risk. It's changing always, frequently in complexity, and also in the way in which cyber attacks are being facilitated by what might be terrorist states, etc., etc. But we know nowadays it's not so much the data loss is important, of course, but it's not so much the data loss now people are worried about, but it's actually because a lot of that data doesn't really end up anywhere. It just ends up in the world web somewhere, dark web. But people are more worried now about the fact that cyber attack will cripple their systems. There are businesses that go bust because they cannot operate any further. So you imagine losing access to all of your data completely, maybe a ransomware attack, absolute nightmare. Um, you know, People talk about insurance and things like that. Yeah, great, but you've lost your data. It's you've got to stay on top of that, but it's definitely still there as the major risk. Artificial intelligence, various aspects of risk around there. But at the moment we're talking about governance lag. Although we talk about AI a lot, still a lot of organisations are still trying to work out what that means to them, the way in which they'll manage it. So there we go. So the top three at the moment that are on board's minds. We can have a look now at the emerging risk radar itself. Okay, and I'm going to let you sort of take that in. And I are going to then also look at some specific areas. Well, Sammy will more so than me. Okay, as I said, there's
Matt,
a lot to consume there. Sammy, go for it.
I was just going to say, is it worth describing how this works? So you'll see the numbers
Yeah,
for
yeah,
each risk,
absolutely.
and then on the radar, you see the worth watchings on the outside, keep monitorings on the inner circle there, the middle circle, and then most prevalent
Yeah,
is in the middle.
yeah,
And, I've seen so many versions of this now over the years, and the numbers kind of slide in and out, kind of back and forth between the worth watching, keep monitoring, most prevalent. And that's exactly the point.
yeah,
Um, and so you can see 2.2 geopolitical change and instability is right in the middle one, as uh, is where's the cyber attack one? 4.1 and 4.2. Those are
yeah.
the ones you highlighted.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Indeed, indeed. And they were the top three based on the sort of conversations we were having. You can obviously see there's a few others that sit in that most prevalent, but the
Mhm.
ones that were the most important to boards were the three we identified previously. I think Sammy's got a view on obviously 2.1, but we're going to come on to that on the further slide as well. So we use standard categories, as you can see, societal through to commercial. We felt they sort of worked based on our experience knowledge. And as Sammy says, we then plot them on those in those three dimensions. And literally the three dimensions are based on what is I was just about to say what's the most popular, but I don't mean it in that way, but it's what's being talked about the most by boards that we're engaging with. However, what I would say is the worth watching is equally as important as the most prevalent because the worth watching are the ones that are creeping around the outside who you might not be paying attention to. The sort of going back to those questions I asked, the five questions, what I'm suggesting to boards is always look at these emerging risks and ask yourself, how will they play through into your organisation? Do they play through into your organisation? Yes or no? If they do, then what does that mean to your organisation? Does it mean that these become a strategic or principal risk in their own right and enter upon your risk register as such and your risk reporting? Does it mean you have to change the way in which you manage risk? Or does it just, does it bring about a new set of controls or additional controls that you might need to put in place? So always think about that. But equally, I think it's worthwhile when you're doing this test to understand Um, if it's not an emerging risk, then why isn't it an emerging risk to your trust? That's equally important. So that's what we largely come up with. I keep threatening to do a sort of seventh, a sort of mapping exercise that shows the trajectory of all of these items that have come in and gone out
Mm.
over the period of the publications that we've been doing. And I will do that at some point, and I'll make sure I share that with CST. What is really interesting, if you think about it, okay, and I think this is why Laura and other leaders like this, is because what you've got is a very holistic view of risk that a business or your organization or CST in this case might be facing. And therefore, what it provides for is quite a sort of interactive, obviously, conversation. And you can see one risk whilst also looking at another and see what the links might be, because one may play off the other, rather than looking at a standard risk register, which tends to be quite transactional. I'm going to come on to that show you later. So what this provides with is just a different way means of reporting on risk, which you might want to consider in order that you can have maybe some different conversations at your board. I've seen organisations, I was saying to Sammy about this, who use reporting in this way. And for example, what some of the organisations I work with do is they will take the narrative on the emerging risk radar and they will, in some instances, colour code it with regards to how effectively they feel they're dealing with that or how important this might be to their organisation. But again, just informing the conversation that might go on at board level. But still, the point being, what this provides is a good conversation piece at board and for you to go away and maybe create your own emerging risk radar relevant to your trust, which may have some other stuff on there that obviously we're not captured but might be local to you. So we're going to dive into some areas. So I think that explains how it sort of works.
Matt, can I make one point, which is
Yeah.
kind of, I find kind of interesting? In the most prevalent, you've got 6.1 increasing operating costs, for example, energy and staff. You've got 2.2 geopolitical change and instability, and you've also got 5.2, which is the supply chain. All
Mm.
of those are related to each other. So when you consider, for example, the Iran war, that because of supply chains and just-in-time supply chains, that means that the impact of a geopolitical situation is immediate on our energy costs, our transport costs, our food costs. So there is a relationship between those risks that are in the most prevalent, which is
Yeah,
kind of interesting to note.
yeah, the interlinkage is it's the interlinkage you can see on this screen more so than I think when you look at risks in a risk
That's
register.
right.
You do need a risk register, and I'll explain why I think a risk register is important when we come onto a slide in a few minutes. But yeah, thanks for that point you made there, Sammy. It's really useful. Just brings it home, doesn't it? To be honest. Okay,
Mm.
so Sammy, do you want to? We picked out a couple of areas that we thought might be interesting, and I did a very bad screen grab of the political policy and regulation area of emerging risk just before
Yeah.
the session started. But do you want to elaborate maybe just a little bit on that political policy and regulation
Well,
aspect?
we know that, yeah, in the last couple of days, we've had some major policy announcements. We've had a cap on exec salaries announced, as well as an announcement about how much we're going to get funded on teacher pay rises over the next 2 years. And so the constant drip, drip of government sort of policies and changes uh, is absolutely an emerging risk. That's why 2.1 is, it absolutely should be, I think, almost moving into the most prevalent, if
I
I'm
bet if we did
honest.
it now, I bet if
Because,
we did it now,
given
we'll
the school's
definitely.
white paper and all of the reforms coming up, the curriculum changes, they're changing attendance, they're changing school food, they're changing allergy management. Everything is changing.
Yeah,
And it is changing constantly. And unfortunately, it's sometimes changing without consultation. So we literally have no idea that it's coming. So I did want to highlight that right now, and especially now with the change of government, with Burnham potentially taking over as prime minister, again, that might mean a whole host of policy changes. So for me, 2.1 100% moves into the middle at this point. So when you republish, that's where I would put it, because it does feel like we're absolutely being impacted by that
yeah,
pretty dramatically.
yeah. A very good observation. Okay, right. We'll just move on for now because
Yeah.
time. The next area we thought we'd expand, and again, Sammy, given your experiences across the trust in governance, is there anything
Yeah.
there that resonate well or
Yeah, I mean, 8.2, 100%. We know we have a sufficiency and capacity issue in governance across the sector. We've developed a very unusual system where we expect volunteers to run our schools and our trusts. And increasingly, we can't find folks who want to do it,
Mm,
unsurprisingly.
yeah.
And so it is tricky. That bit is tricky, and it requires us to do governance slightly differently to accommodate people who also have a job, might have a family. But also, I think that 8.4 really resonates with me. This loss of trust in institutions, in my view, is what's leading to the rise in complaints. In the past, there was a lot of respect between schools and families. Increasingly, that feels like it's eroded. And it's a symptom of a larger issue we have societally where people have lost trust in institutions. And it is largely because of a phrase that I learned when I read this book called The Unaccountability Machine, called accountability sinks, where large organizations feel like no one's accountable, right? It's so big that you can't quite tell who's making the decision and no one is really accountable. And that I think has been felt increasingly across society that when you have an issue with your bank or you have an issue with NHS or your airline, it's impossible to get an answer. You actually can't get through. And I'm afraid I think there's a danger of that happening to us in schools, especially as trusts get larger, that we're going to become accountability sinks as well. And people will start to even lose even more trust in us as institutions unless we become very attuned to feedback from our stakeholders and develop that relationship with them again. So those are the ones that resonated with me.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, Sammy, like, okay, we were never going to have time today to talk about
No,
solutions because it was never going to be the case, and solutions often are individual to schools. But
right.
one of the things that I find about emerging risk, just as an aside, is where organisations do engage early, and this is the whole point, engage early and think about what you're going to do about it, is that's what drives the innovative solution in many ways.
Absolutely.
And I think actually CST is well set up where, organizations who are thinking about some of these types of risks can share their knowledge through the CST membership. And I think it's a great mechanism for doing that.
Mm,
Whereas other organizations I work with, where they're just businesses, they don't tend to do that type of thing.
mhm,
So,
mm,
I think that's where we can be ahead of the game, ahead of the
yep,
curve, think about how we're going to manage this type of stuff, what we're going to do about it in readiness. You mentioned about, obviously potentially Andy Burnham will become Labour leader. He's
mhm.
very obviously strong on devolution. He's made it
That's
clear
right.
already that he wants to do more devolution. Now, that may be opportunity for
Hmm.
multi-academy trust. I don't know
Good.
what at the moment, but just given his devolution message, could be
Hmm.
interesting just to explore where that's going to be going and what that means to education early doors. Anyway, okay, we could get into very subjective rabbit
Yeah, we
holes there.
could.
So let's go. Economic and financial, I think you've probably already mentioned
Yeah.
one,
Well,
Sammy.
and I was in a room full of CEOs being trained yesterday. And when we went around the room and asked what everyone's biggest challenges were, it was basically down to finance and falling pupil numbers. And we have increasing costs. And at the same time, we have falling pupil rolls. And the DFE has not really been giving us any strategic direction around falling pupil numbers. We have not gotten anything from them in terms of thinking about how we're going to manage the fact that in every single region, bar east of England, pupil numbers dropping. In London, it's projected to drop 13% over the next few years. So finance is going to continue to be an issue for the sector. And, the fact that they are not going to fully fund the teacher pay rises is going to make things even harder over the next couple of years.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I was doing an event with HESPA, which is a higher education strategic planning authority. Obviously, we ran a poll on that session and we were talking about long-term viability of the higher education sector.
Mm.
They're feeling it as much as you are in some
Oh,
respects.
100%.
And if I draw a comparison, again, I don't mean to be controversial, but if we are thinking about, servicing pupils, families in the future, then, and sustainability of the trust sector, merger has got to be on the agenda. I have to
That's
say
right.
that. Looking at alternative ways in which back office services can be provided through a core hub, that type of thing,
Hmm.
groupings of schools becoming specialized schools, that type of thing.
Yeah.
It's going to be on the cards, definitely. So, the more we're ahead of this, the more we can prepare our trust for that, and where we want to be on that
Yep.
journey, whether we want to be a leader or whether we want to be a participator or we,
Hmm.
just want to be a passenger. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's
Okay.
what it's there to do. So. Okay, so I did mention that looking at time-wise, we're okay, just a couple of minutes, right? So um, you can see the emerging risk radar there based on ChatGPT data. Screen grab, okay, from a friend of mine, Paul Griffiths, Director of Governance and Risk at Leeds University. But what he was suggesting, and he uses a product that RSM license, and I'll mention that right at the end, called 4Risk, but he produces from 4Risk. And largely what he was trying to say was, we can report differently as organisations on the way we present risk to create different dialogue and conversations in different arenas. It doesn't have to come out in the form of, as you can see behind, a standard risk register layout. Don't get me wrong, I love a risk register. Think about your risk register as being your risk ledger. This is where you capture all those core data in connection with the risk. What is the risk? Why is it a risk? The scoring, the controls, the control owners, maybe assurance, the action you're going to take, that sort of stuff. You need a risk register for that repository of risk information. But then you've got to think about how we take that information and take it into our board or our committees. Do you need to put a risk register on the table? I would argue not. You could produce a report specific to the stakeholder needs of that committee in order that you can have the right conversation and dialogue. So I just wanted to sort of show the difference between two things. One is neither better than the other. In fact, both rely on each other and are required. But think about the way in which you're presenting your risk information, and particularly when you come to emerging risk. I think it's a really important part that you capture emerging risk and have some mechanism to continue to monitor it. Your own radar is perhaps a good way to go. Okay, the next slide is going to be blank only because,
Matt, can I
yeah, go
ask
on,
really
sorry.
quickly?
Yeah.
The emerging risk radar you produced there, and this is based on ChatGPT data. What does that mean? Did
Oh,
Chat
okay.
produce that for you? Just so
No,
we
no, the
understand who
radar, the
produced that.
radar came out of 4Risk, our risk management system, directly out of it,
Ah,
flick
I
of a
see.
switch. The data was we were looking at emerging risk in the higher education sector, and Paul
Okay.
literally did I've just run some data, the point he was trying to make was let's think about the way in which we present this
Oh,
information. Not just
presentation is key.
yeah, the presentation is
100%.
key for engagement purposes, exactly. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to put that out and say both are important. But think about your stakeholder group that you're
Yeah.
working with, who wants to know what and the way they want to see it. Okay,
Yeah. Brilliant.
there we go. Next slide is blank only because Sammy and I were doing a quick sort of play around with the slides at the beginning. So forgive me, you can breathe. Okay, so emerging risk. So I think first of all, three things you can do with your trust, right? One, I think is a great leadership, trust leadership exercise. I do think you should be building into your trust agenda cyclically, whereby you spend time thinking about these emerging items that are out there and what that means to your trust. I do think you need to have some way and means of capturing that and to ensure that you stay on top of it in order that you can continue to monitor it and think about what you're going to do about it. And communicate that out within your trust. So maybe head teachers, staff understand how you perceive things and what's going on. Very important because that also makes them feel important because that's that part of that communication engagement. And think about all of this because it plays through into the way in which you report on risk, your decision you're making that you're taking, going back to that strategic risk component slide I showed, how it impacts on your risk appetite. So when you've done all of these exercises, you've got to definitely then go and review your risk appetite, your strategic risk mitigations to make sure you're still on point with them because they will change. So that's your three things I would say take away and do, and they're easily doable. Okay, I did mention 4Risk. Okay, this is my blatant promotion. This is almost my fee for doing this set. Some of you will be using the Insight for GRC platform, RSM's digital governance risk compliance suite. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Some of you have been familiar with the term 4Risk or 4Action or 4Policy. That's the Insight for GRC suite. As you can see, it's got lots of nice interactive dashboards that we report from. So maybe thinking about what I just said about the way in which you report. Yeah, it produces a risk register, captures information, but there's lots of other ways in which you can do these. All dashboards are personalized to end users. I'll talk no more. If you want to know more, contact Sammy or me.